And today's morning session, we're looking at the purpose of governance in creating sustainable institutions in the public interest. And I'm Aaron Porter, I'm Associate Director Governance at Advance HE, but I also experience governance on the board of two UK universities. I'm Chair of BPP University and Deputy Chair of Goldsmiths. And the big conversation is a sector-wide initiative where we're looking to reflect on where higher education governance is presently, what's working well, but what we should be open to discussing, to looking at changing, and to continuing to think about innovations. And it's a partnership across a number of organisations. So it's Advance HE working with CUC, with Universities UK, Guild HE, IHE, and AHUA. And today's session, we've particularly worked closely with independent higher education on the session that we've got in front of you today. This is going to be a session in 3 parts. That's what we're going to fit into over the next hour. We're shortly going to hear from 2 keynote speakers, and I'll introduce them shortly, a chance to hear some reflections from them on the question we've got in front of us today. We'll then have a little bit of a chance for some discussion and any questions that you want to put to our speakers. So bear that in mind as they're speaking. If there are things that you perhaps want to follow up on or clarify or offer a reflection in the form of a question, then there's an opportunity to do that. That will all be recorded and we'll share that on the website up until that point in the webinar. And then in the final part of today, when we turn the recording off, we'll go into breakout discussions, and it will be a chance for you to share with other colleagues who were with us on the call today your reflections on the question in hand, and we'll briefly feedback in plenary at the end. Although in the interest of time, we probably won't have an opportunity to hear from every breakout group. But if there are some of you that would particularly like to share the headlines from your discussion, I'll try and capture that. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of what the format is for the session today. And again, very pleased that you're able to join us. So let's turn to our 2 keynote speakers. And let me first introduce Kamran Razmdoost, who's the Dean of the ESCP Business School at their London campus. He's also a Professor of Management. He serves as the Managing Director of the campus's Corporate Services Board, responsible for providing executive education to leading multinational businesses. And once we've heard from Kamran, we'll also hear from Mary Curnock Cook. Mary was previously Chief Executive of UCAS up until 8 years or so ago. And Mary since then has had a portfolio of a variety of roles, including being a governance practitioner serving on several boards across the education sector. She chairs Pearson UK's business and the Dyson Institute of Engineering and Technology. She's a council member at the University of Leicester and a NED at the London Interdisciplinary School. And she's previously been on the boards of the Open University and the Student Loans Company. So really delighted that both Kamran and Mary are able to join us. And so without further ado, I'm going to ask Kamran first to offer some thoughts from his perspective on the role of governance in relation to sustainability. So Kamran, over to you first. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Aaron, and hello everyone, and it's my pleasure to be with you and with Aaron and Mary on this panel and on this session. I would like to start with 3 characteristics of our sector before talking about governance and sustainability in particular. First is the diversity of higher education institutions, and we have institutions with different types of stakeholders and different types of contribution. Perhaps in independent higher education, we see more of that. To give you an example of my own institution, ESCP Business School, we are a registered charity in the UK, but we are owned by ESC in France, whose their main shareholder is Paris Chamber of Commerce. And you see that across the sector, that sort of diversity of types of institution and diversity of stakeholders. Second is that we pretty much all of us are operating in a hybrid logic mode. So on the one hand, we have public interest social responsibility, but on the other hand, we also operate in a national or global competitive market. So in a way, it's more like a social enterprise situation where we operate both on a social logic, but also on a market logic. And then the third point is the speed of change that we are going through. And I think we've experienced a little bit of that with digital learning and digital and tech innovations and COVID and Brexit and immigration policies. But in the future, the speed of change would be even bigger with the advancements of AI and so on and so forth, and the impact it would have on research, education, and services that HE sector is offering. So to be able to respond that, our governance models needs to be flexible enough to be adaptable to this sort of diverse set of institutions and bring diverse set of skills and representations. And more importantly, we need to make sure that we have agile governance models to respond to the speed of change that we are going through. And looking at sustainability, both from a financial, environmental, and social perspective, it is something that needs to be embedded across our institutions from the top to bottom into our curriculum, into our operations, research, leadership culture, and so on and so forth. And to be able to respond to that, I would like to highlight two key points that I think we need to focus more on. The first one is to focus more on relational governance. And I think we've been doing great in developing processes, hard and formal governance tools and mechanisms and arrangements. But I think that the agility and flexibility that I was talking about requires a relational governance and an informal way of flowing information, connecting people, and making sure that we allow our institutions to make quick decisions, effective decisions, and execute them. Second one is the connectedness of our governance. As I said, I think we need to have sustainability to be embedded across organizations, and we see that sometimes at the top of the organizations we have amazing stuff happening, but it's not connected to the ground. And then third element, going back to that hybridity that I talked about, the fact that we are operating in competitive markets requires risk taking, both the hybridity and the speed of change. And I think we need to allow our institutions to take risk. We need to redefine the way we treat mistakes and failure. So in a way, we need to allow our institutions to become a little bit more entrepreneurial. Entrepreneurs have something called test and learn. So in a way, mistakes and failure, it become part of the assets of our organizations so that they can learn transparently from failure and mistakes and react to it. So I think that would be my key contributions to these sessions with a focus on relational governance, connectedness, and risk-taking. Aaron, back to you, and I hope and I look forward to further conversation today.
Fantastic. Thanks, Cameron. I think those three takeaways are really very well made. That point around relationships and relational governance, the connectedness through the organization, and the comfort that we have with risk taking from that bringing that entrepreneurial strand into our governance. And I have a question that I'll ask you once we've heard from our next speaker. So let's turn to our second keynote speaker. I'll hand over to Mary to offer some thoughts also on this general topic in hand, but particularly thinking about financial sustainability and governance. Mary.
Brilliant. Thank you, Aaron, and good morning, colleagues. Thanks so much for inviting me to contribute to this seminar. And as you heard from Aaron's introduction, I have now got a fair amount of experience in governance generally, but then also in the traditional and the independent higher education sectors. So, well, actually, my first comment, Kamran, I really enjoyed your comments just now, but I think I probably should have spoken first because, of course, without financial sustainability, there isn't any other kind of sustainability I would contend. I think I'd also add that the current parlous state of university finances is definitely a governance failure, as well as all the other things that have contributed to it, you know, the funding deep freeze, government policy, immigration rules, and so on. Now, I know universities don't like being called businesses, but humour me for a minute. You may have a whole range of purposes, charitable constitutions, civic and social responsibilities, and so on. And they go further than most other business sectors, but it really doesn't change the fact that you need to have at least a bit more money coming in than going out, even if you aren't under pressure to deliver growing profits to shareholders in many cases. I would also argue that an absolutely key chapter in any university strategy should be the financial strategy. And, financial strategy is more than just a financial forecast. The financial strategy really needs to set out how you intend and plan to fund the wider strategy, typically over a 5 to 10 year period. It needs to, set some assumptions about inflation, about fees, recruitment, research income, and so on, and then critically test these assumptions against the risks of them turning out worse than predicted. And I think this really puts an onus on members of governing bodies to really stress test the information that's put in front of them. And I'd ask, how many of you, whether you're governors yourselves or governance professionals, how many of you have looked at a history, for example, of recruitment forecasts to see how often these have proved to be sometimes wildly over-optimistic? And you probably know the OFS, the regulator, has long been pointing out that over-optimism in recruitment is an issue right across the sector. And I would also say that, the risks of geopolitical and immigration concerns, they've been clear to see for quite a number of years. So having said those few things, I've got 3 key points for better governance for financial sustainability. So the first one is about the skills that you have on your governing body. And somewhere in there, you need to have the skills to hold the executive's feet to the fire on financial strategy. And PS, a redundancy program is not a financial strategy, it's a crisis move. Secondly, I would suggest that you check that you're not doing what I call performative governance, by which I mean, that's where the executive and the governance team churn out long papers that are really just activity reporting or some kind of narrative. And I do think that governance teams have a really critical role in understanding what governance is, and therefore what information the governing bodies need to enable them to do their jobs. So I would say for both governance teams and governors and board members, ask yourselves, so what? What is the so what of this paper that helps the governing body understand the strengths, weaknesses, and risks to the financial and wider university strategy? Then my third point is about risk. So I would suggest you really check that you're managing the risks and not the risk registers. No one, I'm sure, likes getting to the risk register in the board pack, which is often, a huge spreadsheet with tiny point size writing that's difficult to read even with your specs on, but which often tells you very little about the real risks to the organization and its finances. I would suggest asking what is the path to green and really hold the executive to account for tracking red risks towards green, or at least to within appetite. And remember that nearly all other risks are highly dependent on financial risk. In other words, if you don't have enough money, you can't mitigate, for example, risks around technology or estates or recruitment. So, and I think I'd emphasize that a risk is not something that kind of looks bad but feels pretty unlikely. It is literally something that could stop you being successful. So in my book, every paper put in front of a university council or a higher education board should have a paragraph about risks, and not just the risk paper itself. So my final point is a bit of a sidebar, but nonetheless important. I do worry that concerns about freedom of information or particular publication policies mean that the minutes of meetings often don't properly record discussion, and particularly any challenge in meetings. I think quite a few universities have quite a distinctive sort of minutes voice that often skates around issues in a rather polite way, as if they don't really want anybody to understand what actually happened in the meeting. Often very relatively few actions are actually recorded, meaning that even quite conscientious council members forget that they've suggested, a particular paper had key information missing, or that overspends need to be better controlled, etc. So I'd suggest more challenge to minutes. Very often that bit on the agenda where the chair asks for approval of the minutes is very rarely any challenge. So I would suggest more challenge to the minutes and more transparency from those writing them would be very helpful to good governance. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Mary. And I really appreciated the way you've sort of got your three high-level points, but also something very practical at the end there. And I agree with you. I've seen a real variety of practice in terms of how well minutes really capture the essence of what's happened in that meeting. Some where you would struggle to see the relationship between the two, and others where it really does tell the story of the meeting. If I may, I'll ask both of you a question arising from your comments, and very happy to take those from colleagues as well if you want to use the chat function if there's anything that you'd like to follow up on. But Kamran, if I might start with you, you spoke about those three points that you thought were really important around sort of relational governance, the connectedness across the organisation, and risk taking. And I wondered if you would offer a reflection on how the general structure of higher education governance helps or hinders those three things. And of course, I'm sure you'll point out that the governance structures in higher education are not homogenous, but there are some general trends that typically exist. And I wondered if you thought that the way in which we structure higher education governance is helpful or not towards those three objectives you set out.
I believe it's more of a culture that hinders than the structure, and I think some of it Mary mentioned. I think it's cultural. Some of the issues that hinders that sort of agility. For example, we have really good representations. I'll give you an example of student representation. Many boards now have a student representation. But when you look at it, you see that at some point might not be fully connected to the student body. You have student unions and things. But so that's why I say that sometimes we focus too much at the top of the institutions, and things are great, but it's not connected to the reality of the ground. So that connectedness become important, and that's why sometimes we have over optimistic predictions, forecasting, and so on and so forth, because they're at the top we have really good connection, but then between senior management team at the institutions and the rest of the organization there is a bit of a disconnection. There are some structural issues. I think the flow of information is quite reactive rather than proactive. And I think it's executives, I think Mary mentioned, with long list of reports or information to the board, and then they review it. And I think part of that is moving to the relational governance, to give more freedom to the board members with different expertise to be able to go across the organization to sort of observe and to criticize and to question different things. The flow of information to me is really important. We need to make it easy and more transparent for anyone to dig down any sort of information that they want. And I think in businesses, you see that there are clear dashboards that start from the top, go to the bottom. I think that's where we need to be, so that it makes it much easier for different members of the board with different expertise to look at set of information, go deep, and identify the areas that they want to question in a proactive way.
Thanks very much for that, Kamran. And I'll put two brief things to Mary, if I may. The first is taken from the chat from Paul Woodgates, who's a governor at De Montfort University and also on the Advanced HE board. And he says, avoiding this point about performative governance, but when boards are being presented perhaps with unnecessary information and wanting to challenge that, how can we make sure that boards aren't missing anything crucial that needs to be presented to them, and how can boards find out if what they need to know isn't being presented to them? So that's that point of almost kind of knowing what we not knowing what we need to know, sometimes from a point of not being domain experts. And a second point, which is somewhat linked, but I think you did mention the importance of stress testing and being confident about the financial projections that are put in front of us, and the over optimism that there's been, particularly with student recruitment. And I wondered if you wanted to offer a view on really why we've allowed ourselves to continually fall into this cycle, and ultimately what will break that cycle so that we stop as a sector collectively. I'm not saying every institution has been guilty of this, but if you look at the mismatch between those presenting a deficit this year, I think we can reasonably say over a half of the sector have probably fallen foul of it at least once. So what do we think will ultimately stop this over optimism in accepting student projections that don't end up materializing?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron, and two really important questions. So Paul's point is a really interesting one, which is, it's the kind of unknown unknowns, isn't it? That boards who are not necessarily very experienced in higher education, but might have a lot of other relevant skills, they don't know what the right questions to ask. And I think I would suggest two critical roles here. One is the chair of governors, and typically a good chair is going to be spending a lot of time with the vice chancellor or the chief executive, and indeed other executive members. And I think part of the role of the chair is to kind of have their antennae out about the things that are important and genuinely manage the agenda. I think I see too often that agendas are kind of almost set in stone, and they come around year after year, and there's not much difference. It would be unusual to find a kind of a big topic to discuss on an agenda. It's kind of going through the schedule of business, which is obviously important. I also think that the university secretary or the registrar or the whatever you call that person, I mentioned in my opening remarks that that's a really, really important role for that person to understand what it is that the governing body needs to know. And I think that role needs to have a bit of independence from the executive. And in a sense, for that part of their role, because very often they're, might be a sort of COO or something as well, they need to be in effect reporting to the chair. And I think between those two key roles, it should be possible to make sure that the right things are being discussed. So that would be my kind of headline answer to Paul's excellent question. And then on to, Aaron, your second question, which was about sort of stress testing projections and why we've allowed this to happen. So, I mentioned this thing about historical projections, and I don't think I suspect that many boards don't look back over what they said last year about the next 2 or 3 or 5 years, and indeed reported to the OFS. And I think if they did that, they would probably take a slightly harder line on understanding the evidence behind the projections. I think it's hard for lay members to understand the higher education market, and indeed, kind of admissions and recruitment in enough detail to know whether what's being put in front of them is correct or not. The other thing I would mention is that, I wonder if regulation plays a part in this. So there are the conditions of registration, the OFS regulations, require you to demonstrate financial sustainability. And I suspect that some universities, are, I'm not suggesting in any way dishonestly, but, the kind of primary responsibility is to put a set of numbers in front of the regulator that doesn't put you on the, ready to be inspected or, intervention list. And so in some ways, I think there could be different approaches to regulation, which would give universities more space and more confidence to talk about, tougher situations, because, well, you've all seen what the regulators had to do, and, suddenly give up a lot of its other responsibilities and start really thinking hard about financial sustainability. But frankly, this is, 2, 3, or 4 years too late now, in my humble opinion.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point, and I think there are institutions that have felt that if they put forward certain numbers, hopeful that they'll get them, as you say, not being dishonest, but it would present a sort of slightly rosier picture of what might actually turn out, kind of keeps them out of the sort of the spotlight for a little while. Similarly, I've come across internal discussions in institutions where the executive will feel that if a certain number was presented as the targets for what departments should be recruiting, that sort of sets them the kind of right sort of target that they should be aiming for, but more of an aspiration than a realistic expectation that that's what they would achieve. But they don't want to lower that number because it looks like it would be sort of lowering the pressure on that on that department. And if you lower the bar, then they might not even hit that. But there's got to be a way of having a more honest an open dialogue within the institution. And of course, what happens very consistently in other sectors is that there are actually yes, there's one central set of numbers that you might post to a regulator, but there'll be upsides and downside budgets which are transparently shared with the board, with mitigating actions as to what would happen, particularly in the event if you hit those downside numbers. You've got a plan ready to go, not having to sort of press the VR button or more than that in the event that you get to September and then you realize you haven't got the numbers that you wanted, which has happened, to be honest, in a number of institutions in the last few years. Let's take one final question. I know we're up against it in terms of time, but it's a fantastic question from someone I know well, and lots of you will, Victoria Holbrook, who's now doing some governance transformation at Cardiff University. And her question is, what might be good examples of agile governance in your view? There is often a tension with excluding some voices or truncating deliberation in order to get things done more quickly. How might we manage this? So, do you recognise that tension between agility and inclusiveness, if that's a fair summary? Mary, I might start with you briefly.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron, and great. Hello, Victoria, and a great question. I do think, if you do the arithmetic, let's say you have a board pack of, I don't know, 300, 400, sometimes 500 pages in a traditional university, and you've got, I don't know, 20 or 25 people around the board table and perhaps 3 hours to cover the material, that clearly does not add up to anything getting enough airtime, probably. I know when I go to university council meetings, I make hundreds of notes as I read all the papers with, dozens of questions. And then I have to pick, 2 or 3, because I know that's the only airtime that I will get. So I do think there's something about the structure of boards which is not contributing to good governance, and certainly isn't contributing to agile governance. And I'll stop there, but happy to elaborate more if you want me to.
Thanks very much, Mary. And a final brief comment from you, Cameron, then we'll go to the breakouts.
Yeah, I think that's where I go to the relational governance piece, because I agree with Marie that you don't have enough space and time in board meetings, and I think that's where two things are important: the chairperson to enable and empower different members of the board or councils to have a little bit of independence and work directly outside the sort of formal arrangement with executives to go through some of the stuff that they feel need more time to get done. So I think that there needs to be a lot more done outside that sort of formal process that we go through. And I think that sort of those board meetings should be squeezed into one or two key points that requires a discussion and representation from all, but a lot of it could be a discussion with someone from the board with commercial expertise and someone from the executive with commercial expertise working outside the board. I think that could tackle to some extent that sort of tension between agility and sort of decision making.
Yeah, and I think there's a fair challenge back to all of us involved in governance. I think we've all experienced meetings where at the end we'll go, did we really spend enough time on the things that mattered most, or did we spend a lot of time on the things that felt that they kind of just procedurally needed to go through? And I think I can probably say with a high degree of confidence we've all experienced that we didn't feel that we always spent enough time on the things that matter most. Well, if we're all, there's a role for the chair, there's a role for the secretary, but there's also a role for governors to kind of frankly put their hand up at the end of the meeting and just say, we need to make sure this doesn't keep happening, and we can challenge ourselves in the spirit of really aligning that in a much better way.